Hello, everyone. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all to this event of the LSE German Symposium. I'm delighted to introduce to you to the speaker of today's event, John Kampfner. John is an award-winning author, broadcaster, and foreign affairs commentator, an alumnus of Oxford University. He began his career in East Berlin and Moscow for the British newspaper The Telegraph. His book, Why the Germans Do It Better, Notes from a Grown-Up Country, was first published in 2020 during the COVID-19 pandemic. At this time, Germany and Germans still, humbly as always, like to consider themselves Corona-Weltmeister or Corona World Champions. And thus, John's book quickly became a bestseller as people asked how Germany managed to navigate the pandemic so successfully. One of the main arguments in John's book is that Germany is politically more mature than his own home country, Great Britain. So today we ask the question, what constitutes political maturity, and does Germany have more of it? We at the German Society are especially interested in what John has to say about more recent developments in Germany's handling of the COVID-19 pandemic, as its championship title can today at least be questioned. We will start with a short opening statement by John and then continue with questions from the audience. Please use the Q&A tool here on Zoom to pose questions to John, stating both your name and current role. And now over to you, John.
Thank you very much indeed, Fabian, and hello, good evening to everybody. It's such a shame that I can't see you. I'm just staring at a green spot, but the green spot will have to do, and I look forward to your interventions, your questions, your challenges, whatever you like. I've done a lot of events surrounding this book since it came out at the end of August last year, and a lot more still to come, including in Germany. Unfortunately, at the moment, that's likely to be digital, but we shall see. When the book comes out in German through Rowohlt at the end of next month. But I always find that there is always at least one question. There is always something that makes me think, I've never realized that before, or that's a new perspective. So that's the challenge for you illustrious LSE students, alumni, friends, guests, and others. As Fabian says, I'm just going to say a very little because I just love engaging with all of you, with the moderator, with the questions about the thesis of my book. I'll just say a few opening remarks. So as I write in the introduction of the book, the very title, when I started thinking about the book and researching the book and talking to German friends, old and new, at the end of 2018, the start of 2019, they each said to a man and a woman, das können Sie nicht sagen, das können Sie nicht schreiben. You cannot say that, you cannot do this. This is a sort of an offense on the German sense of well-being to write a book of this title. The more they said it, the more determined I was to write it. And the more I wrote it, the more convinced I was of it. But of course, a title is only a title. It's a marketing tool. It's a trigger for discussion. And I can talk for some time about all the aspects of life in Germany that Germans do not do better. And we can come to that if you so wish. For me, it's unfinished business. As Fabian says, I was posted twice to Germany, to the small town in Germany of Bonn, and then to Ostberlin, where I was fortunate enough. I still have my old DDR Presseausweis, my GDR press card with the compass on the front. And I was privileged enough, and it was a privilege, to see not just the events of the war, but the events leading up to it. I was in the Gethsemane church when it was surrounded by Volkspolizei, and it was only a couple of months, it was actually only a few weeks after Egon Krenz, the real power in the land, praised the Chinese solution on Tiananmen Square. There was absolutely, this is one of my contentions in the book, the idea that freedom would come to Eastern Germany and that Germany would be reunified with so little crisis, notwithstanding the mistakes that were made and the problems that followed, is an extraordinary testament to Germany. I kept up with Germany in the intervening time. I'd been in Moscow, I'd been back in the UK covering British politics, working for the BBC, editing the New Statesman, but I'd sort of put Germany on the sort of simmer pot, and I really wanted to go back and see it for myself again. And at the start of 2019, Fabian is right in saying that when it came out in the summer of 2020, and I'm sure you're going to ask me about the vaccination disasters of now, but when it came out in the summer of 2020, on the Today programme, on all British outlets, the second question to every government minister was, well, the Germans are doing it like this, why can't we do it like this? And this was after every single British announcement, which always began with world beating, only to collapse after a few days. But at the start of 2019, it wasn't like that at all. The German and foreign media, I remember reading pieces in the New York Times and elsewhere, were being incredibly disparaging of Angela Merkel. They were saying she had gone past her sell-by date, Germany was atrophying, we were almost back to the Economist 1999 famous cover, Sick Man of Europe, nothing was moving in Germany. And that was the period in which I started the book. Maturity and what I would regard within the UK, but I'm less interested in talking about the UK tonight, but of course, if you want to ask me about it, please do. At what I ascribed the UK as the infantilization of politics. I regard Brexit not as the cause of a single woe of this country. I see it as a long-term symptom of the woes that have befallen us. A country that struggles to cope with the present, struggles to plan for the future, and therefore applies balm, applies ointment on itself in the shape of singing Rule Britannia and waving plastic flags at every possible opportunity. You need only to look in any respectable bookshop, if there is an international relations part, which in general news bookshops in our monolingual mediocrity is quite hard to find. But when you do find a German section, about 95% of books will be regarding the two world wars. And I am, at the risk of sounding immodest, I'm absolutely not just amazed, but incredibly relieved and gratified the reception that this book has had. It plays to what I hope, and perhaps it's no more than a hope, is a latent, if grudging, respect and admiration for Germany that I hope to tease out. So why do I, to the title of this discussion, Germany's many faults are the flip side of its many successes and vice versa. This is a country, in my view, that has yearned for stability since 45. As I say at the start of my book, in the first 75 years, and you'll all know that only in January this year, Germany marked, or really didn't mark, 150 years of the creation of the German state. First 75 years or thereabouts were a tale of horror, militarization, culminating in the 33 to 45 Third Reich period. The second 75 years is an astonishing record. I categorize it, I subdivide it into 4 dates. 1949, the establishment of the German state, the Grundgesetz, the basic law, which is a document that, unlike other written constitutions, has, and particularly the American one, has stood the test of time. It is both solid and in many ways immutable, but also flexible. And broadly, although there are of course challenges, has been an incredible stabilizing and emancipating force on Germany. It has built into the system checks and balances between parties in terms of coalition government, between the center and the regions. The regions act as test beds for all the various increasingly exotic combination of colors of political parties that start to work with each other, and then that then gets promoted onto the national scale, by which point, with the completely valid exception of the AfD, everybody is used to working with everybody else, and that is a great pragmatic approach applied to the principle. German politics through the parliament, designed by Norman Foster, is a great monument in my book to the principle of the people standing over the politicians, but also to how the way politics should be done. It's maybe boring. It's committees. It's all about getting the work done. It's about finding compromise and agreement. It is not about binary, confrontational, rhetoric-based performance art, which is the particular British way, which obviously goes down well with foreign viewers. At the height of the Brexit saga, a very good friend of mine in Berlin said to me that she had given up her Netflix subscription because she got all the entertainment she needed by watching the British Parliament. To which my response was, well, if you want humor, why don't you go to the comedy show, and if you want to see a clown, go to a circus. And for me, that is the great merit of Germany, personified through the 8 chancellors, and particularly Angela Merkel, who I first got to know in 1990 when she was a junior advisor to Lothar de Maizière, the first and only democratically elected leader. And I thought she was smart, self-assured. Obviously, I had no idea the meteoric rise that would take her. And we'll obviously come to the question of what happens to Germany after Merkel. And I am exceedingly underwhelmed by Armin Laschet, if it is to be him. And I do regard that in a number of ways as a problem. So 1949, the second period was 1968, which was not just the radical student movements, protests, anti-Vietnam. It was also the beginning of the political and societal maturization of the country. Vergangenheitsbewältigung, coming to terms with history, really only began properly then. What did you do in the war, Dad? What did you do in the war, Mum? Really only began then. Everybody prior to that was focused on just putting bread on the table and getting the country back onto its feet. The third period, 1989-90, nothing much more needs to be said about that in this introduction, except to say I defy anybody to find another country that could have done what Germany did in that period. The final period prior to COVID, it was 2015. Merkel's extraordinary decision to take in more than 1 million of the world's most destitute from North Africa and the Middle East. You know the story, the awful picture of that dead little boy on the beach, the enormous caravan of some of the most traumatized people in the world making their way on the perilous seas into Italy or Greece and up through the Balkans or wherever, increasingly having water cannon thrown on them, barbed wire erected. And what was Merkel to do? She was slow to understand the seriousness of the situation, but in the keeping of the cliche about Germany, langsam aber sicher, she got there and she made a decision that actually she didn't really have much of a choice. As she said herself in one of the chat shows, what was I, a German, supposed to do? Build camps, ? She had to take them in, but she did so, and the organization around it. But alongside the sort of stereotypical German organization was an incredible compassion, and the numbers of people who volunteered, who worked. Now the figures on integration, on employability, on people on training schemes, people who have found work, is exceedingly impressive. And so I throw that rhetorical question back again. I defy anybody to come up with a country that could have done what Germany did in 2015, when a tiny little dinghy of Iranians crossed from France into Britain in Christmas I think it was 17 or 18. The then Home Secretary, Sajid Javid, almost sort of declared a national emergency, sending out a sort of faux macho squadron of flotilla of naval ships to pick up this sort of destitute set of 2 or 3 families. That in some ways to me is the difference. A country that knows what a problem is, the ultimate test of an individual, an organization, a country, whatever, is not whether you face problems, because we all do. It's how you deal with them, how open you are. And that for me is the test. It is a refusal to indulge in hubris. It is a meticulousness, a self-questioning that can sometimes become an artifice, can sometimes be an excuse for inaction. And we can come to foreign policy, where I'm very critical of Germany on policy towards Russia and China. But in the round, the structures create the people, and the people are the reflection of the state of a country. Britain only appears to feel comfortable when it is in confrontation. Look at its, not just the decision on Brexit, but its chaos that ensued, and now its pugilism with regard to the European Union. Fine, it's one thing to leave, but it's quite another to build quietly, responsibly, a new set of relationships. But once again, we fall into a sort of dad's army type approach to politics, where it's all about the Straits of Dover and fending off Johnny Foreigner. I'll leave those remarks there. Happy to talk about anything you like about institutions. Feel free to say whatever you like. If you want to tweet about it, it's my name, @John Kampfner, and engage with me in the future, because I regard this book as, and I talk about the environment, I talk about social systems, I talk about foreign policy, I talk about economic structures in great detail, and the Mittelstand and the regional greater sense of equalization in the regions as opposed to Britain. There's so many areas that I haven't yet covered, and I want my book to be a trigger for a conversation, a means to an end, not an end in itself.
Thank you very much, John, and we will use that trigger immediately and have a conversation about your book now. Maybe to just start off, you just said that the UK struggles to cope with the present, Germany struggles to cope with the past. And after the war, of course, Germany had to find a new place in the world and how to define its new role. And I think we're still struggling with it sometimes. What are the lessons that Brits can learn from Germans actually on that regard, especially in light of Brexit now, how to define their new role in the world? Is it global Britain?
Well, you see, the war, particularly the Second World War, I think has paralyzed both countries in a different way. I do believe that Germany's incredible post-68 and particularly post-1990, there was still work to do after 1990, coming to terms with the past, not just in a breastfeeding way, but in a very rigorous academic way, in a systemic way, as well as in an emotional way, has been a remarkable success. And other countries, famously Austria, Italy, and others, and Japan, most of all, did not undergo that process. And it's very interesting, there's a whole debate at the moment about empires and colonial legacies. And Britain hasn't begun that discussion really in earnest. France, Macron is trying to push it. Interesting micro discussion in Germany about its colonial legacies in Southwest Africa, although which were pretty brutal, but much smaller empire than the British, French, Spanish, and others. So Britain is paralyzed by its past, in the sense that, I mean, and this is not an original point of view, I so hoped in 1997 when Blair came along that we would turn a corner and we would have modernization, which does not mean you jettison your traditions. The royal family, as we know, is a great selling point, both in disputes and out of disputes as well. Many of the traditions, the great buildings, the stately homes, there is a huge amount of Britain's past that is extraordinary, but the past is the past, and the past does, in so many ways, is holding us back. You look at the decrepit state of our parliament, you look at the ridiculous mannerisms of our parliamentary procedure. Again, it's entertainment. It doesn't lead to good, efficient, and people-facing governance. And so it is not just a question of taste. This is a question of how to run a modern society. By contrast, around that time also, when Joschka Fischer committed German troops in anger for the first time, and it took a Green foreign minister to do that, he felt impelled to cite Auschwitz as the reason for doing so, with an implicit comparison with Srebrenica, and the crime of inaction is as great as the crime of action. And as many people said to me then, the two failures or weaknesses since then is that Germany has not really stepped up since that time. That was going to be the start of a more robust German foreign policy, working in tandem with partners rather than hiding behind partners, and that has happened to a small extent, but not very much, and disappointingly so. And the other one is, in order to make the case, and I'm not talking only about military action, I'm talking about more generally, you look at Germany's approach to Russia at the moment, and when Steinmeier, the president, said recently that Germany still owes Russia a debt for the horrific actions of the Germans on the Eastern Front, that to me was emotionally understandable, but historically ridiculous and politically illiterate, because that has been done and it will never be forgotten. But Germany needs to deal with Putin because it's Putin, not because Germany did terrible things in the early 1940s. And so Germany is being held back equally. And some would argue it's almost luxuriating in that as an excuse not to be robust. And it was easy in some ways for Merkel to be in conscious distinction to Donald Trump, because Trump was who he was, and Trump regarded Germany as the enemy and absolutely viscerally loathed Merkel. It's going to be a lot harder for Germany to behave like that with a Biden presidency.
So, okay, perfect. Thank you. I want to encourage the audience to maybe use the Q&A tool you find in the bottom right, but I will start asking questions now that you post, and you can upvote questions as well. So Julius Roderer, an economics student from LSE, asks, Germany has a large bureaucratic apparatus, which might provide expertise and maturity, but does it not also prevent policy innovation? And as we can see during the pandemic, promote old patterns of thinking?
The short answer is, if you pose it as a does it, the answer is yes, it does. The real problem that Germany faces is a bureaucracy, but bureaucracies only grow if societies allow them to grow. It's a risk-averse culture. I was talking to a number of DAX 30 CEOs about this. The absolute failure of Germany to create a strong tech base. Berlin now has a kind of cool and up and coming tech startup scene, and other cities to a lesser extent as well. But the failure of Germany to, with its incredible engineering base and science base, to really become an outrider in this sector is seriously problematic. And we know the one kind of muscular company that started doing so, and that was Wirecard. And we know what happened in that story as well. If, as it was explained to me, if a German, well, for a start, it's changing among the younger generation, but not as much as it might do. There is an aversion to startups, to being self-employed. Why don't you get a proper job? Anybody's parents might say, go and work for a large corporate instead of one of these shared office spaces that, people are regarded in other places as sort of de rigueur, but in Germany, they still slightly struggle. But of course, that's all changing at a reasonably fast pace. And by the way, COVID has had one good tech. I mean, it's forcing Germany to become more digitized. The absolute refusal to use plastic in payments, I always found it astonishing. I never quite understood it. The refusal for obvious historic Datenschutz, data protection reasons to have medical records online has set Germany back in the pandemic and elsewhere. Doctors rifling through paper and the non-transferability of your medical records, notwithstanding the security aspects of that. So in the digital space, broadband speeds slower than Albania's. We know the story. There is a massive catch-up exercise for Germany too. The single biggest one, I would say, is this, that when a German entrepreneur starts a company, and if it goes under, that person struggles to get bank financing, struggles to get credit card permissions, and is even in some ways a sort of, as was explained to me, a bit of a social pariah. Oh my God, what happened? Your company failed. I remember doing when I was running the creative industries body in the UK, doing an event with Korean counterparts. And I talked to 2 or 3 guys, they were in their mid-20s. And one said, so I asked them to explain, they said, this is our 6th startup. And I said, what happened to the other 5? He said, oh, they all went bust. And they said it with big smiles on their faces. As if to say, and that's great, that's what you do. You try an idea, it fails. You try another one, it fails. But that's the key to success. Germany needs a lot more of that.
Perfect, thank you. I'm moving on directly to the next questions by Archie Stay, a policy advisor. It strikes me that the single biggest factor that differentiates Germany from the UK in terms of political maturity is the proportional voting system. What are your thoughts on this? And do you think that the UK should switch to a proportional system? And actually, just to add on that, from a German perspective, there's actually a lot of people in Germany right now actually thinking, why don't we not being huge fans of the proportional system, because it sometimes also makes it less interesting. German politics is very dull due to it.
The short answer is, given the choice, and there are lots of different proportional systems, of course, there's greater degrees of proportionality and all of that. I would much rather have if you just give me a sort of an X or Y, heads or tails choice, I would go for a proportional system. But it's about more than that. You need a whole political structure. You need a political constitution. If you have an upper house, it's got to be elected, or it's got to be ex officio in terms of regions or whatever else you want it to be. You just don't have it sort of 80-somethings, nice sinecure, half of whom are asleep in the chamber. And there's no sense of accountability, although quite often some of the best thinking and work is done in the House of Lords. So proportional in and of itself won't solve our problems. We need an absolute political overhaul in behaviours. Now, of course, it does give you the, quote, smack of firm government, but as we all know, governments with huge majorities, whether it was Blair in 97 or Thatcher or Johnson's impressive one in December 2019, very rarely get more than 40% of the vote. So there is a lot of unfairness in the system. The middle party, the Liberals, although they are in deep trouble now for a number of reasons, have always struggled to have a voice. And more interestingly, it leads to tribal politics. So it leads to people joining mega parties rather than, you know, if you think of any political system, just if you look at the spectrum, there are people who belong to the far left, socialism, social democracy, liberalism, Christian democracy, conservatism, and the far right. That is the sort of spectrum. And to have a sensible representation of where any country lies in that spectrum is surely the healthy way to be, which is roughly where Germany is. It has the 5% barrier. Obviously, the meteoric rise of the AfD, particularly in the Eastern Länder, but across all Länder, shattered that defense barrier. And that is something to consider further. I'm cautiously optimistic, but Germans will correct me if I'm wrong, that the AfD more than a year ago, in fact, getting on to 2 years ago now, hit its high watermark. But of course, it will stay as a dangerous reflection of problems and a dangerous challenge to the system. But it should also galvanize politicians into understanding not the policy planks, but the resentments that have led to them.
Just to double down on that, what I'm interested in is particularly, I think in Germany is this understanding, sometimes it's this coalition building approach to politics. And you said you have these different regions where you can basically test these different coalitions out. But doesn't that mean also that it's sometimes very hard to find compromise, and this process takes so long that the important decisions that must be taken today in order to ensure, for example, future economic prosperity in the country are for a long time drawn out. I mean, we see that especially in the digital world where we have a lot of different parties arguing about, everybody says, of course, we want it, but still nothing gets done. And in the UK, it sometimes seems that if you have a government which has absolute majority, they just go on with it and get it done, or like at least say they're getting it done. Maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like sort of, you know, if you want to play poker in the casino, you're going to win some and you're going to lose some. And when Ursula von der Leyen remarked that the European Union is a tanker and Britain has now become a speedboat, it had unintended consequences of Brits saying, yeah, we love speedboats and we don't want to be on a tanker. In other words, it does allow that nimbleness, that fleet of foot, that ability to rise to a challenge. But on the other hand, I don't necessarily agree with your characterization, because unification was the ultimate challenge, was the absolute ultimate challenge. I mean, you cannot imagine anything happening like that to a country, and Germany rose to it. The 2015 refugee crisis, similarly. So I don't think in and of itself, when an actual crisis happens, the system is works against it. I think there is a bigger societal risk aversion and old-fashionedness and sort of wait until the last person has caught up approach in Germany. That does slow it down, which I think is less a systemic question than more a psychological one.
Okay, perfect. Then I will move on to Rolf Pfeiffer, a managing partner at, I'm hopefully not mispronouncing it too badly, Bernotat in C. As someone who knows both the UK and Germany incredibly well, What are your ideas for making it attractive to Germans to become more experimenting, more outcome and less process orientated? More applications first rather than principles first. Less Bedenkenträgertum, where we start asking what if it works as opposed what could go wrong. And I
Yeah.
think that's really important also for maybe on the question we asked beforehand.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that question has been excellently posed, and it's exactly that. It's the fear of things going wrong. It is the, what would the neighbors think, if I tried something and then I lost my job. And instead of people thinking that's great, that person is entrepreneurial, innovative, etc. I mean, so many aspects of Germany, which brings me to the inverse of my thesis, do wind me up. I mean, I remember back in the day and still now, the Ladenschluss absolutely does my head in. I find Germany is still a producer economy rather than a consumer economy. It is therefore the people who work in organizations, in terms of the service sector and in terms of the public sector, less than it is for people who need the services of that. And I think a bit of a slightly more intolerance of slowness would be a good starting point.
Okay. Is there then, so this has been very much now government's focus, soaking on the political realm. Maybe can we look more in the business side of things? Well, we also have these, I mean, the biggest tech company in Germany just failed very notably, the Wirecard. The question is, how can Germany become maybe also more willing to take on these business risks? And do you think that this will be something that we will become more problematic once becoming more European overall? As we have to integrate and cooperate, you have these European champions now building up. Do you think this will complicate things, or do you think that this is actually a chance and Britain is missing out on it? Or do you believe that?
It's a really, really good question, and it is too early to tell. I can certainly give some thoughts about the two possible scenarios, and it could well be a mixture of both scenarios. The European Commission and the European Unions, which are in so many ways a reflection of the German zeitgeist, and I think will, I don't aggrandize Britain, but I think Britain's departure harms the EU to the extent that it was more of the buccaneering entrepreneurial country within the EU, along with the Nordics, the Dutch, in particular. And I think the recalibration of the EU back towards a more sort of a slower pace, I think, is going to be problematic for it. At the same time, as so many people say, look, you have the two global superpowers, United States and China. Then you have the third pillar, which is the European Union. The challenge for Britain, this little island drifting off into the mid-Atlantic, is can it develop, whether you call it the Singapore on the Thames or whatever we wish to call it, can it be, I mean, does it want to be, and it's an unfortunate analogy, does it want to be Hong Kong to China? Does it want to be Taiwan to China? I mean, Taiwan is an interesting example. It's the sort of permanent irritant. Does Britain really want to be, and it certainly started its first 3 months as if it does want to be, the permanent irritant, the country that undercuts, the country that is constantly needling? And I think it'll get some quick wins from that, and there will be some business wins. I don't think, and corporations always value the interventions and the profiles of their governments. They don't act in isolation. And I think a Britain that is tolerated rather than is brought to the center of the table, that is regarded as a problem to be managed, rather than a partner who you want to bring in because you want its active, constructive contribution, I think will damage business, and I think it will damage entrepreneurialism as well.
Perfect. You already brought it up, China. There's a question from Dizzy Yu. She's asking on China policy. Do you think, or Germany, or maybe the European Union overall, is being too mercantilistic in it? What can the UK learn from it, appreciating the UK is less reliant on exports to China than Germany? And maybe to expand on that, do you believe that the UK will become more closely connected to China now that it has left the EU?
Well, it's very interesting. Just starting on the UK point, in terms of the politics and the rhetoric around a pure human rights-based approach, the UK has used its departure from the EU to be much tougher. It has denounced China more vigorously on Hong Kong. It has opened itself up in terms of passports to Hong Kongers to come. And it'd be interesting to see how many do. And it has also been much more rigorous and robust towards Russia, with the connections and the similarities and the dissimilarities of both cases. At the same time, the UK is presiding over a collapse in trade with a bloc of 27 countries that accounted for 48% of its trade. And the figures with Germany in the first 2 months are shocking, and they're replicated to different degrees with other countries. And it's not just trade. I was listening to a program I'm sure you all absolutely avidly listen to, Farming Today, on Radio 4, one morning when I woke up early, and it had Liz Truss, the trade minister, on. And she was being challenged about British farm exports to the European Union, both live animals and foodstuffs. And they were everything was completely collapsing because of the new paperwork, to which the minister responded, well, they can always sell these things to Asia. To which the interviewer said, well, actually, you can't really take cows and pigs to Asia, and you can't export, wheat and other foodstuffs and vegetables to Asia and get them back in the same speed as you can to Europe. So there is almost a deliberate lessening of ties. This wasn't Britain wants to leave, but then we want to have a brilliant relationship with the European Union, as Michael Gove said on the day we actually left. This is a deliberate diminution, and Lord Frost is the personification of this more adversarial approach. So if you lose your best friends on your doorstep, well, you're compromised, and you're compromised in a number of ways. The Biden administration will get on with us fine. We've got the G7 in Britain. We've got the COP conference in Glasgow. And so Britain will be centre stage and will do its thing. But there's no particular warmth with the Biden administration, and there's no warmth at all with the European Union, both because of our actions. So that does compromise us, and we will go wherever it takes. Saudi Arabia, UAE, forget kidnappings, forget killings, out we go, because we're desperate for the business. Back to the questioner and China. Yes, Germany is desperately overexposed to China and to emerging markets. That was always a structural problem. I've spoken to people I did a security paper for RUSI, the defense think tank, about this. And there was one particular occasion in which Angela Merkel was on a delegation to China, and she was in a meeting with the prime minister, not the president, and they were talking about businesses, and she had about 10 CEOs, German CEOs, around the table along with their Chinese counterparts. And she started ever so gently and pre-agreed to bring up various questions around the Uyghurs and around Hong Kong and other issues. And the German business leaders were furious with her afterwards. So there is a problem with that side of things. And ultimately, this is a business does what politics tells it to, and this is a political solution. And if Germany doesn't step up, we have the Belt and Road. I did quite a lot of reporting in Duisburg, where the Belt and Road station ends up. There is, in a different way, also a German overexposure to China, which brings political weaknesses with that.
Okay, I think we now really discussed a lot already from German foreign affairs or British foreign affairs. So maybe let's take a look inside of Germany. And there's one question which was asked by Lucille Crumpton. What do you think has prompted the rise of the AfD in Germany? Which is an easy question that nobody ever tried to answer before. Do you think that it has any links to Nazism, Germany's dealing with denazification, especially because also, of course, because the AfD is much stronger in the East?
Yeah, gosh, we could all be talking about this for a very long time. There is a lot of breastbeating about the toy hunt and the decisions that were taken on unification, about Besser Wessis and about resentments of Ossis to Wessis. I'm going to be very reductive here and quick, and this obviously doesn't give justice to the argument, but I have very little tolerance of those arguments. The eastern states have already achieved 80% of per capita GDP of Western states. They're on target to reach parity in 2030. And this is the killer point. The average per capita income of people in the Ostländer is higher than in the north of England. And we've had a hell of a lot more time to sort out those divisions. So the problems are not economic. There's the classic Kulturkampf, the culture war that is being played out everywhere pretty much in the world. I think one of the arguments against proportionality is that if we had a proportional system, we would have a similar type of party with at least as much support all over the place. And again, more in places that are disadvantaged than others. France is toying with, for a second time, Marine Le Pen as their president. Again, these are all products of systems as much as societies as well. So it is not an exclusively German problem. And of course, there are links and there are neo-Nazis and there are problems in the police force, in the Bundeswehr, in the security services, and I'm not remotely downplaying anything. I was doing a BBC series in October, and I spent some time in Cottbus, and I met some fairly unsavory characters with unsavory views. So it is a difficult problem, and it is a problem that will not go away, but it is not a German problem.
Okay. Yes, I think there's a lot to be discussed about the AfD, but sideline that now to maybe move on to a party which is probably also going to give the next chancellor, which is the Conservative Party. And how do you see future developments in the Conservative Party, given recent changes in leadership? You already mentioned you're not overly convinced by Armin Laschet. So are you a Markus Söder fan?
Well, it's a sort of process of elimination, really. I was a Norbert Röttgen fan, but he was a niche product, and I think he would have been great. I hope he becomes foreign minister, whoever becomes chancellor. I'm excited by the prospect of the Greens being very central in the next government. It's not impossible that it won't be a black-green CDU, CSU Green. It is still possible for the arithmetic to go the other way. I would say that whoever took over from Merkel, it is like the football manager. It's like whoever took over from Alex Ferguson when he left Manchester United. Whoever takes over from somebody who has been in a job for a very long time and notwithstanding their mistakes are regarded as absolute titans in their field are going to struggle. Whoever that person was going to struggle. I'm not convinced by Laschet, and I think some of his Russia policies worry me, and his dealing with COVID has not been enormously impressive. People are selling shares in Jens Spahn for the longer term, but usually people who are regarded as the next chancellor, the next prime minister, never become that. So we'll see what happens after this. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with Markus Söder, who has, and it'll be fascinating to see if the CSU, it didn't happen with Strauss, it didn't happen with Stoiber. Will it for the first time happen with Söder? The impressions I have, Bavarians in your number may disagree with me, is that he is a different type of CSU leader from them. The CSU has moved in a direction like that. And I think if the counterbalance to that is the Greens, I think it will be absolutely fascinating.
Yes, but wouldn't Markus Söder actually, because like if you put Markus and Angela Merkel next to each other, they're very different personalities. And the question now is, in your book, you often talk about this very Merkel as being kind of a picture of also the German mentality in a lot of ways. How does Markus Söder fit into this? Is he the new type of German mentality, a more maybe also aggressive or optimistic or outgoing, forward-looking type of person, less careful?
Well, the person who really personified that was Friedrich Merz. And I was very pleased that he didn't prevail. I'm not sort of proselytizing for Söder. I'm not saying he's the answer to everybody's dreams or anything like that. But you have to seize change. And don't forget, as I was saying in my opening remarks, at the start of 2019, Germans appeared to be desperate for change, and they were desperate to shed, well, not desperate, they were keen, they were very grateful to Merkel, but they were keen ever so politely to say time to move on, and she was forced to pre-announce her departure, and the AKK experiment didn't work out. So we've been talking a lot about the flip side to German stability, which don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, to use that old English phrase. Don't play with stability. Stability and security are incredible things to have, but build on them. And entrepreneurialism, innovation, a more robust foreign policy, a more risk-taking economic policy does not have to be antipathetic to stability if you get it right.
Okay, perfect. I think we are almost out of time, so I will maybe ask some questions that can be quickly answered.
Right, Stichwort.
So to just make it quick, and you can only name one for each, is Angela Merkel's biggest achievement and her biggest letdown. You can only name one and not much discussion around it.
Refugees, and biggest, well, she would probably now look at the second half of the COVID side of things in terms of thinking of her legacy.
Okay, that's interesting with the COVID legacy, because I think that's really where the judges are still out, because that's a problem actually in Germany with the regionalism. It's sometimes very hard to assign who actually is at fault, and now everybody is fighting about who is the one that made the mistakes with the vaccine. Some say it's the
and interestingly, her opinion poll ratings have not suffered, actually, which I find interesting too.
So yeah, that's something to also a specialty of Germany, I think. There's one more question, and that's something I also would be interested. Simon Gurevich asks, good afternoon, Mr. Kampfner. Which resources do you recommend for German culture, politics, and business? You already mentioned there's it's very hard to find books on that other than World War II and World War I books. So is there like one or two books you would recommend?
I would hugely recommend Neil MacGregor's book. As you know, Neil MacGregor was director. I'm searching for it here in my bookshelves, and it would require me to get up and get it, so I won't. But here we are. And it accompanied his when he was director of the British Museum, and then he started working with the Humboldt Forum. A great fan of Germany and another great fan of Germany, don't know whether you would call him a resource, is David Chipperfield, who's responsible for some of the great buildings in Berlin and other cities as well. And what's really interesting, the German embassy, I actually really take my hat off to the German embassy in London and also the British embassy, new ambassador in Berlin. They're really trying to address some of these issues in a people-to-people way. And that's what I suppose that's my departing thought for students, particularly the younger members who have been watching this, that if you are German and you have affection for Britain and links with Britain, or if you're a Briton and you have affection and links for Germany, or if you're a mixture of both, there's never been a more important time. German language teaching in Britain has collapsed. Foreign languages in Britain has collapsed anyway. And we've left the European Union, and we can, as I do, we can complain about it and write about it in negative ways, but actually it is incumbent on us to find ways to build bridges, to develop all kinds of cultural, person-to-person, city links, and whatever else like that. We don't have to leave everything to the politicians. So do get in touch with me. My website you can find if you Google, and similarly email me and tweet, whatever, because I just really, and there are lots of people, Germans and Brits in Berlin, in London, and in other cities, who are really, really keen to get some good things going.
Perfect. On that, I will quickly wrap this up. So we end right on time. To Daniel Schuster, Norbert Reis, whose questions I unfortunately couldn't ask, I can highly recommend the book because it's actually going into those two questions that you posed, and I think for you would be quite interesting. So the book is Why the Germans Do It Better. There's a German version coming out on the 21st of April. And there's also, which will be a bit shorter because John will not explain Germany to Germans as much as he does to Brits. And there's also a paperback version coming out on the 6th of June of the book. Yes, you heard it already. Reach out to John if you have further questions, or check out his website. From the German Society, I would really like to invite you to follow us on our social media and also sign up to our newsletter so we can share with you any upcoming events. There should be very interesting events coming up in the future. Unfortunately, Ursula von der Leyen has postponed her event, which would have taken place tomorrow, but we are sure that we will find a new date and announce it to you anytime in the near future. So yes, thank you very much, John, and we look forward to seeing many of you in the audience as well soon at the next event.
Thank you, Fabian, and thank you everybody for attending.